Hi, I'm Mark Sir of Crenshaw Associates, and I'm excited to welcome Bill Glenn for this episode of our Crenshaw Cameo podcast. Bill is Crenshaw's executive chairman, guiding the firm's long-term vision for growth and serving as a mentor to the firm's most senior clients, sharing knowledge gained as a CEO, president, and public director. Prior to Crenshaw, Bill was CEO of American Express's Global Business Travel Unit, the world's largest corporate travel management company, operating in 140 countries around the globe. Today, we'll explore Crenshaw's leadership model and how it came to life based on Bill's experience and the insights of our talented executive coaches. Bill, welcome and thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Mark. Good to be here.
So, Bill, you have described leadership as situational and experiential. So I think a great place to start would be for you to share kind of how some of your own experiences, some of the situations you were in as a CEO and an operating executive shape the way that you and our firm think about leadership.
Sure. I'd start with that it's not just situational and experiential. It's actually a journey. And to me, leadership isn't an academic exercise. There have been millions of books written about leadership. To me, it starts with a journey. One of the greatest leadership lessons I learned was standing on a football field over the summer when I was a counselor at Joe Namath's football camp, and Hudal Hicks was Joe Namath's roommate in college. And he didn't play, he was the equipment manager. And a couple of us were standing around at a break, and we were counselors. And Hudal Hicks came over and he said, "You know, boys," he said, "you can't coach what you don't know, just like you can't come back from someplace you've ever been to." So, of course, all of us laughed and paused and didn't think much about it. But as I've had experience, it was probably one of the most insightful leadership lessons I learned, which is it's not about knowing the X and O's. It's all about experience. It's all about a journey. And so I've been fortunate enough throughout my career to start selling toothpaste on the streets of Manhattan and back rooms of supermarkets, to leading a small team at Procter and Gamble, to running bottling operations with 600 Teamsters in New Jersey for Pepsi and negotiating those contracts, from moving from consumer products and business to business at Pepsi to financial services in American Express and having global responsibilities. And all along the line, I've had different experiences and different situations, and I've learned from a lot of my mistakes. And that's why I start with, it's really a journey that you keep learning, whether it's a different business model or different teams or different disruptions and innovations. Fortunately, I've worked for some really good bosses that value people and developing people. It really started at Procter and Gamble when you were evaluated not only about the performance, but importantly by the people you were developing. And if you couldn't develop people, you weren't going to get promoted yourselves. And the reason was that Procter only at that time promoted from within. And so their next view management was about developing your people. And one of my first bosses always said, good motivated people make good business. So it's both selfish because you're developing your folks and getting great results. So there have been lessons throughout. I've been blessed with having multiple experiences in multiple business models with various countries and situations. And that's really been instructive for me as a leader.
Yeah, that's a really great place to start. So if we kind of fast forward now to the last few years, which have obviously been marked by significant disruption in the workplace, you've got the adoption of hybrid workforces as well as AI representing really durable shifts in the market. So what do you think at this point is going to separate the leaders who have been thriving in the environment from those who've been struggling to adapt? And what will be those critical capabilities moving forward to sustain that performance?
Disruption has been, if you think about the last 25 years or so, there have been a series of disruptions, right? Which is we had the tech bubble at the end of the 90s. Then there was 9/11, which is a different kind of disruption. Then we had the financial crisis in 08, 09, and then COVID, right? And now we have further disruption from we've had technology disruption and innovation, but AI is another key disruptive milestone. And so what I think it's critically important as you move through disruptions to fundamentally think about a couple of things. One is that you want to define winning for your team, given the situation. Prioritization is critically important. Prioritization of investments and capital allocation, right? Picking up the key priorities and really focused on execution and what you can control. And then, we use terms like agility and resilience are critically important, certainly. But I think ensuring in a leadership capacity that you're staying close to the marketplace, close to your people, right? And then focusing on those key priorities that get you through the disruption.
That makes a lot of sense. Really keeping your eye on the ball, as it were, rather than being distracted from all of the disruption that's going on around you, because that's going to be the case your entire career, right?
Yeah. And I think the one critical point in that is being close to your team. I would say that COVID was a different kind of disruption because you could no longer walk the floor.
Right.
And talk and meet with your people. And at Pepsi, we always talked about casting a leadership shadow, which also meant coachable moments in real time. So all of a sudden, you're not able to do that. And I think one of the watch outs in today's environment is that in a hybrid environment, there are folks who aren't getting that type of leadership. And you really have to be conscious of that. People interact differently on Zoom. Teams act differently on Zoom. Sometimes you have, introverts, extroverts, they show up differently, and you have to recognize that, right? But fundamentally, it's really important that your teams, and whether they're very junior or senior, always need leadership and guidance, and to recognize that maybe a Zoom meeting doesn't make that happen. And so you have to be really conscious of that and making sure that they're getting the individual leadership that they need.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So if you were advising a newly appointed executive in this environment, how would you encourage them to sort of establish that credibility and influence early on and really get a sense of where the team is at?
For every newly appointed executive, whether it's the team themselves or their leader or their peers, are looking for what kind of leadership, how are they going to show up? And I think the most important thing is making sure that you focus on your team, the dynamics with your team, ensuring that you establish trust, not only with the individuals, but with the team. There's something I always call collaborative conflict, which is to make sure that people trust one another enough to have candid debate about issues, because ultimately that leads to the best decision. But you can't just be internally focused with your team. You have to understand where your team has influences outside that particular function. And so you want to have an external lens, and something I talk about, which is internal density with the team and a wide external breadth, so that you're reaching out to various organizations and functions within the organization, and then also having an external lens on the customer. And sometimes that customer are internally, depending on what the function is. Sometimes they're customers or prospects, but always to have a lens to understand what's happening in the dynamics of an organization or affecting your business model from non-legacy competitors.
Yeah, I'd love to double click in on collaborative conflict, because you've often said that is a hallmark of great teams. So what do you think are the signs that a team is getting that right versus drifting into dysfunction? Because it can be a very fine line, right?
I think it's a leader's responsibility to ensure that people have the trust in one another, they can speak candidly, and to have strong debate. One of the terms that I've never been really fond of is just the use of the word collaboration. Sometimes collaboration, to me, becomes a cultural killer, because it says that it's not just that people should get along, which is, yes, absolutely, people should get along. But collaboration often means that everybody needs to agree. And sometimes that means deciding on the lowest common denominator, right? And so to avoid that, it's the leader's responsibility, ultimately to make the right decision or to make a decision, right? Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're not. But you get the best possible outcome if you can hear different points of view and to have debate. And for people to understand that this is not personal and it's not a personal attack, and people should feel free and trust in one another and trust in the leader to have that kind of debate. And so I like the term collaborative conflict because it does speak to a culture where people trust one another and can collaborate, but they also can have aggressive debate over issues. And ultimately that leads to the best outcome. And it takes a while to do and to promote. And I think a leader has to just encourage. Sometimes, as I said, some voices stand out more than others. A leader's responsibility is to ask people to weigh in, knowing they have areas of expertise, but they may be hesitant to raise their voice. And so I found that's one of the best ways to get to the optimum outcome.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, as we kind of move into this new world of AI-driven, technology-driven leadership, what do you think are some of the dangers of fully outsourcing leadership feedback? And how can executives ensure that the feedback that they're giving is truly experiential, like we've discussed, rather than sterile?
In terms of feedback and I talked about danger of outsourcing leadership to technology, right? And certainly as people use more AI more and more, there may be a tendency to do that. One of the facts that I saw was startling to me, maybe not surprising, but disappointing to me, is that overwhelming majority of employees would prefer getting their feedback from AI than from their boss. Now, that said, 95% of the leaders would perhaps rather have AI deliver the feedback than deliver it themselves, right? Because feedback should be tough. It should be candid. It should always be in a positive light, right? But feedback's tough. It's tough to deliver sometimes. It's tough to receive. And so I think there's a danger in outsourcing that area of leadership because growth comes from candid feedback. It comes from various sources, like a leader's responsibility is to see that individual in different kinds of circumstances, right? And so how would you get that kind of context from AI to give some of that feedback? You can feed into all the prompts you want and all the information you want, but can you really feed back Mark, you and I go in to see a customer and you're presenting and we have a dialogue about that with the customer. And then afterwards, I'm giving you some feedback about the call and how it went and what we think of the next steps. That's almost impossible to replicate in a technology or an AI-driven world. So we have to be very, very careful about how we use or how leaders are using it. I would say the more and more comfortable it gets to have AI delivering feedback, you're missing a whole lot of the feedback that could be really constructive to somebody's career. Because ultimately, an individual has to learn to influence individuals, right? And work with individuals and understand conflict and how to resolve conflict. And it's not just a one-on-one. It's not just inputting some data into AI to provide that feedback. It really comes from experiences, right? And observations, both personal and in a group setting.
Yeah. So let's look at it from the other side, from the executive's point of view, where as they move up in the organizations, the flow of feedback that they're receiving, since they have fewer people above them, is really starting to dwindle.
Yeah.
So how would you recommend that they build systems to ensure that candid feedback is coming so that they themselves can continue to improve and don't stagnate?
Yeah. It's a really interesting question because the higher you go in an organization, there's a natural barrier to flow of information, right? And sometimes there are gatekeepers. And so the CEO doesn't necessarily always get the right information from the organization. And, there's no magic formula. It's about having town halls, having round tables, Some of the best discussions and leadership lessons I ever learned was sitting around with frontline performers at Pepsi who are delivering the soda, or just throughout the organization at American Express, having these roundtables with different levels of the organization and different functions in the organization. And so people want to talk about it. And if they trust the organization, if you create a culture of trust, they're going to give you candid feedback about what's going on, about what's working and what's not working. And so, I talked about casting a leadership shadow. It used to be the ability to walk the halls in an organization, to touch people and sit down with them. And there are different ways now to do that. But I think it's a concerted effort. You have to have a concerted effort. I know there are leaders like Steve Squeri at American Express that go down to the cafeteria and sit, right? And so it's being exposed and having that level of exposure to organizations and to people that you get the free flow of information. It's not survey based. It's not an engagement survey. It's one-on-one discussions. I used to sit on the phones with our customer service reps and sit there and listen to the calls coming from customers, right? And it's not evaluating the service rep itself. It's hearing the voice of the customer and having that dialogue with that customer service team. So you have to make a concerted effort, right?
Yeah. I was just going to say that's the key theme here, right? You do need to put in the effort to go and be with the frontline employees to actually get that feedback. It's not just going to flow through to you.
Yeah. Pepsi, we used to call it focus on the front line, right? And in fact, in the 90s at Pepsi, they reversed the pyramid. So the CEO was at the bottom and the route drivers who interacted with the customers were at the top of the pyramid. And it was just a really great example that frontline focus and focus on the customer and the voice of the customer are critically important. And it's also a way to drive change in an organization, being in front of the customer and bringing the voice of the customer into the organization. So when you're talking about change and why we're doing change, it's not just mandating, here's what we're going to do, but to get the greatest support for that and harness the organization. It's about bringing the voice of the customer and how the customer is changing and what the competitors are doing, not just the competitors you're used to, but non-legacy competitors, which in today's world with technology, barriers to entry have reduced. And it's easier for a new competitor, right? Or a competitor that you didn't realize was there to enter into and disrupt the business model, disrupt the value proposition, and ultimately disrupt your customer relationships.
That's really excellent points there, Bill. So I want to ask you one more question because when we did this intro here, I had mentioned that you led the spin-off of Global Business Travel from American Express. So I'm just curious, with a significant corporate event, what do people need to think about when they're going through those kinds of events?
Yeah, I think those are episodic events. They're significant. And I realized early on how significant culture and establishing winning looks like to an organization. And so one of the key what count factors for leaders are to define winning, develop the team, deliver the results, and do it the right way. There was a customer service representative who worked for American Express for 25 years. Who, when we announced the spin and started the work to spin off, came to me and said, I've been with this company for 25 years. What should I tell myself about global business travel? I love American Express and I love the culture. And what was really telling to me was that my responsibility was to define to the organization that culture may evolve, but values stay the same. The values we held at American Express aren't going to change, right? Still a big brand, the largest corporate management company in the world, but the values that we held at American Express are going to stay. Now, the business model changes, and because the business model changes, the culture needs to adopt and evolve. but I think they were asking for the values that they held true and what was important to them personally. I mean, literally, this man was in tears, just talking about, how much he loved the culture and the values that we held at American Express, and was fearful that that would dramatically change. And how should I think about it? And how should I tell my family about what we're doing in American Express Global Business Travel that was changing versus American Express? So I think it was an instructive leadership lesson in making sure the organization understood why we were spinning it off, right? What winning looked like, and how we were going to adopt and adjust and change, but the core values that we held would stay the same.
And so, Bill, you obviously have a track record of working in various industries with very large organizations like Pepsi, Procter and Gamble, American Express. You now moved to the smaller advisory firm in Crenshaw. And how has that sort of changed the way that you've thought about leadership, moving from the practitioner, if you will, as the executive, to the advisor, advising the executives?
Well, joining Barb and Crenshaw has been one of the great experiences I've ever had, and for a couple of reasons. Really, really good people, a terrific business model, and an ability to add value, right, in a very complex market at a very complex time, right? The transaction was in 2019, and then we had COVID. And to me, as I said, leadership is a journey and experience is everything. And this was another huge disruption, not just for the companies that Crenshaw serves and the people, but Crenshaw itself, right? And so the principles that I've always thought about and adhered to in terms of leadership don't change really at all. It's just a different model. And now we're our folks who love their craft, who interact directly with leaders, and in fact have had line and functional leadership experiences themselves. So they've sat in the seat. And what a great opportunity for Crenshaw, and a differentiation in our value proposition, is to have our folks who are seasoned former executives and seasoned coaching and advisor experience to interact with our customers and our clients. And at the same time, for me, the closest, I guess, folks on all my senior teams, one of them has been the head of HR, because it's about talent and developing an organization, are critically important. And so now I'm in a space where we can translate those experiences and my point of view from a sitting executive to the CHROs and the CEOs that I'm interacting with and Barb's interacting with, and the leaders, CEOs, CHROs, and the leaders that our teams are interacting with. And so the leadership principles don't change. You need really, really strong people, motivated people, to define what winning looks like for our organization at Crenshaw. And that's to continue to create a differentiated value proposition that speaks to the issues and opportunities that our customers have. That holds true to, I think, any business model, and certainly pay dividends here at Crenshaw. We have great people, constantly learning. We're now in a space where we're creating an ethical framework around AI, not only for our people, but for the marketplace, and using technology to support and add value, not to substitute for those interactions that our executives, advisors, and coaches have with our customers, executives, and clients.
That's a really great story, Bill. I appreciate you sharing that with us. So, Bill, thanks again for joining us here on the Crenshaw Cameo podcast. And thank you to everybody who's joined us to listen. And we're looking forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks, Mark. Enjoyed it.